I know in books I have read about the people who were instrumental in creating that technology, and then after the Second World War, when we had used a couple of atomic bombs on Japan, that they all seemed collectively to be um, horrified and just deeply concerned about what the technology that they had created would bring to the world eventually. And you just went over a way to maybe mitigate some of the risks there. And you have spent many years on this topic and are a world expert on what happened in the Manhattan Project and what the details are of atomic technology. What else do you think, if anything, comes to mind? Western countries or countries in general might be able to do to mitigate the risk of the destructive force of these technologies. It seemed to me in my own lifetime that we were kind of lulled into a delusion that this technology was no longer a risk, and in the last couple months, this subject again has become utterly relevant in determining what's happening currently in Eurasia. How do you think about that in general? If there are any other strategies or game theory hypotheses that come to mind. Again, I'd be remiss if not to ask you your thoughts on the subject.
Well, there have been efforts, continuous efforts, since the end of the war to cage this threat in the structures that our societies have had for centuries to deal with things like this. For example, and most obviously, diplomacy, treaties. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, when everyone kind of breathed a sigh of relief that we hadn't managed to destroy ourselves, and it was so much closer than it seemed at the time, and it was terrifying at the time, I remember it vividly. But we didn't know at the time. Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, went to a meeting 20 years later in Cuba of the participants, including Russian generals and so forth, to do a sort of postmortem on this horribly close call the world came to in 1962, and discovered to his horror, he had not known at the time of the crisis, that there had been warheads on missiles in Cuba. We thought they were just then being shipped on freighters from the Soviet Union. There were already missiles at hand. Mm-hmm. In fact, Castro tried very hard to get Khrushchev to let him use them, in which case it would have been the end of everything, to the extent that there were enough bombs around at that point. We had a lot more than the Soviets did at that time. Mm. But there have been efforts ever since then. One that followed from the Cuban Missile Crisis was the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was signed in 1968 and took effect in 1970, and committed non-nuclear nations, and for that matter, nuclear nations, except they didn't follow up on their commitment, to, in the case of the non-nuclear nations, to agree not to build a nuclear arsenal in exchange for knowledge and technology for peaceful uses, most of all for nuclear power. And Kennedy at that time had been advised by the CIA that there would likely be 30 nuclear powers within a couple decades, which horrified him, of course. What would the odds be that someone wouldn't go to war with nuclear weapons under those circumstances? So he and the Soviet Union really worked together to get this treaty passed, and many countries realized that it was not to their advantage to build nuclear weapons, and here was a way to be rewarded for not doing so. And so today we have 9 nuclear powers and not 30 or 40. But the 9 nuclear powers committed to working toward eliminating their arsenals, and they haven't really followed through, obviously. There were only 5 when the treaty was signed. Of course, some have followed since then, like North Korea and Pakistan and so forth, India. We haven't really followed through on our agreement. And it was a near thing 25 years after that treaty was signed, when it was supposed to be reviewed for renewal. Most treaties are perpetual. Once they're signed, they go on perpetually until they're broken, as it were.
Yeah.
But in this case, because the other countries were so suspicious of the nuclear powers, rightly so, that they wouldn't fulfill their commitment to the treaty to try to eliminate their arsenals, that they said, we're going to review this treaty in 25 years and see if you've followed through. And it was only because of the very dedicated work of an American diplomat named Thomas Graham, who's a friend of mine. He went around to 60 countries over the course of 2 years and talked to their leaders and talked them into agreeing to extend the treaty indefinitely, as other treaties typically are. So Tom saved the day by his arguments, but we still haven't, of course, we still haven't moved in the direction. In fact, the United States, for example, right now is supposedly modernizing, whatever that means, its nuclear arsenal. We constantly change out the structure of our weapons anyway, because there are various kinds of corrosion that get into them in the course of time. These are volatile materials and so forth. So it's not as if we need a modernized arsenal. But that was the deal the Republicans wanted in order to agree to any treaties, and some of the treaties that have been signed after the end of the Cold War. In any case, my point is, we're still kind of hung up, but we're trying to surround. There are now treaties in Africa that no country will hold nuclear weapons. In the South Pacific that no country will hold nuclear weapons, and so on and so on. So there is a move to, if you will, bound the nuclear powers with a world that doesn't approve of nuclear weapons, has pledged not to build them themselves, and in a sense to put a moral pressure, rather the way it happened over the years with slavery. There was slowly a transformation in the way people thought about slavery, because it became a moral issue for countries and their international prestige and so forth. So there's a continual pressure toward eliminating nuclear weapons in the world, but it's really difficult for nation states that think they give them power. You know, when India tested a series of bombs in 1998, the defense minister in India said, now the big boys will have to let us sit at the table with them. So the national so-called prestige of being a nuclear power is floating around in the background as well. It's a very complicated issue, and I understand it is.
Yeah.
And we haven't made the progress we should have, but we have made some.